get to you. They'd have to get past us. America's Navy.
Good morning. Now that was a commercial by the Navy. There are commercials that I couldn't find all of them, all the branches of the service. But I showed that because what they said was so powerful. To get to you, they have to get through us. That means that our U.S. Armed Forces, our first responders, our law enforcement community are standing in the gap. And that's what this lesson today is all about. Standing in the gap. And so, I want to start with something a little more light and lively. One Sunday morning, the minister noticed that 7-year-old Alex was standing out in the hallway staring at a plaque on the wall, just motionless and staring. So the minister walked up and tapped little 7-year-old Alex on the shoulder and said, "Good morning, Alex. How's it going?" He said, "Just fine," but he never took his eyes off the plaque. And finally he said, pointing to the plaque, "Reverend Duke, what is this?" And Reverend Duke said to him, "Well, it's a memorial to all of the men and women who died in the service." And little Alex looked really puzzled, and he looked back up at the plaque, and he said, "Did they die in the 10 o'clock service or the 11 o'clock service?" So it's my job, filling in for Reverend Duke, not to have any of you die before this is over. So I'm going to be as to the point as I can be, talking about standing in the gap. Did you know that former slaves helped to initiate the holiday we celebrate as Memorial Day? Well, I didn't either, but I read somewhere that on May 1st, 1865, in Charleston, South Carolina, the former slaves found the bodies of 257 Union soldiers buried in a mass grave at what used to be the Confederate prison camp in Charleston. And they decided that as an expression of gratitude, they would exhume all of those bodies and give them a proper burial. Following that process, they had a parade down the streets of Charleston. 10,000 people came to the parade. 2,800 black children, former slaves, celebrated with gratitude for the sacrifice that had been made to set them free. I didn't know that. I also didn't know that the first Memorial Day holiday was called Remembrance Day, and it was started when a group of women got together and petitioned the U.S. War Department to allow them to decorate the graves of the soldiers buried at Arlington Cemetery. The War Department agreed with one caveat, and that was they could only decorate the graves of the Union soldiers. The Confederate soldiers were buried in a separate, segregated part of the cemetery. Now, think about this. If you've seen any of the Civil War stories, you've read any of the history, you know that many mothers and daughters and brothers and sisters and aunts and grandparents had children, sons who were buried on both sides, had sons who were actually at war with each other, not necessarily by choice. And so they had sons who were buried in the Union side of the cemetery and sons who were buried in the Confederate side of the cemetery. So the mothers were a little torn, but they went along with what they were told to do. So on May 30th, 1868, they had a ceremony at Arlington to honor those fallen soldiers. General Ulysses Grant, who became president the following year, spoke, And after he spoke at the ceremony, a gust of wind came up out of nowhere and blew the flowers from the Union side to the Confederate side. According to history, many people said this was an act of God. And so they decided to obey God and never to segregate the ceremony again. Now, I don't know if you knew that history, but I didn't, and I found that really interesting, because what that says to me is that those former slaves and those women stood in the gap. They stood in the gap. The scripture I've chosen today is from Ezekiel, the 22nd chapter, the 30th verse, and it's about standing in the gap. Ezekiel, his name, he's Hebrew, his name is who God strengthens. And it appears that the people of Israel were in a little bit of a turmoil. They were enjoying themselves. They had other gods, and so much was going on. And so Ezekiel was trying to warn them about who and how they're supposed to be. Standing firm for something. You've heard the old saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. He said that God was looking for people to stand for something. And he said God is looking for someone to stand up for what is right and to be the hero that is needed. Well, back in those days, in biblical times, all of the cities had walls built around them. And those walls were to protect them from the enemy, the invaders. And the broken parts of the wall caused them to be vulnerable to intruders. And so God said to Ezekiel, I need someone to stand in the gap, to defend my people. Now, the people of Israel took their freedom, their long sought for freedom, for granted. And so they didn't heed Ezekiel's call. Ezekiel and others were taken into captivity from Jerusalem, the city of peace, a place of peace within you, to Babylon, a place of chaos. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had experiences in my life where I've gone from 0 to 100 in 5 seconds. I've had experiences in my life when things were going along so well that, you know what they say, it seems like it's too good to be true, and then all of a sudden, all hell break loose. Now, some of you may not like that word hell, but I'm telling you. We've been talking about it in the Wednesday service. It's one of those dirty little words that we say, oh, you can't say that in church. It's a 4-letter word. But it's the truth, isn't it? Don't you ever find yourself, things were just going along so well, and then all of a sudden, boom, everything just, your life just gets turned upside down. Well, that's sort of what happened at this time in biblical history. This is a parable. This is a story. So you have to pick out what that means to you. But metaphysically, the walls stand for protection, or they stand for defense, or they stand for support. A wall can be whatever you decide it is to be. The broken places in the wall can be those negative thoughts that start trying to infiltrate your life. And so Ezekiel was saying, not in the literal sense, but in the metaphysical sense, the spiritual sense, that we need to build up our walls. And the way we build up our walls, the way we stand in the gap, is we use prayer and meditation to fill in the gap. Now, we can't always stand in the gap for ourselves. I first heard this term not too long ago when Reverend Julian Telesford, I and several others were on a committee reviewing candidates for the ministerial path. And one particular student was having a difficult time. And Reverend Julian said, I'm standing in the gap for him. I'm standing in the gap for him. I like that expression. So I started to think about Ezekiel standing in the gap, relying on Spirit, encouraging us to place our faith in God and not in whatever the outer appearance is in our lives. Ezekiel demonstrated in this story how to create order out of chaos. He went from order, a city of peace, a place of peace, Jerusalem, that's what it means metaphysically, to Babylon, a place of chaos. And he figured out how to stand in the gap and make order out of chaos. The video I showed you was no accident that it was about the Navy, even though my husband was a Marine, and they're kind of rivals. But I shared it because Bev Allen, who's one of our congregants, retired from the Navy. And she shared a story with me that demonstrates what I'm talking about this morning. She was on R&R, rest and relaxation, and she had taken her mother on a trip. And during this trip, she was checking into a hotel, and the clerk noticed her military ID and said, "Oh, you're in the service." She says, "Yes, I'm in the Navy, active duty." She says, "Oh, I have 2 sons on active duty. They're right now on the front line in Iraq." Bev's jaw dropped, and she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. And she was just about to say something apologetic when the woman interrupted and said, "God is watching over both of my sons. If they don't return, I understand that it is their purpose in the world. And if it was meant for them to fight for freedom in this war, and if it's meant for them to return, they will." This mother was telling Bev that she is standing in the gap, not only for her children, but for freedom of all people. Bev was so touched that she has carried this story with her all these years, and thank you, Bev, for sharing it with me. This mother was at peace even though her sons were in harm's way. She understood that every life has a divine purpose, no matter what it appears like. Standing in the gap refers to praying for others as well, when they cannot pray for themselves. Imagine a brick wall, and you're butting your head up against that brick wall with no hope. And then someone standing in the gap utters a prayer for you. You may not even know that they're praying with you. If we are consciously aware of all of those areas in our lives that are triggers, the gaps, the jealousy, the envy, the hatred, the self-righteousness, the emotional wounds that haven't yet healed, and we don't strengthen our resolve for them or find someone to stand in the gap for us, we may become weaker. We may not find that sense of peace and freedom that all of us want. So prayer and meditation are the best sources. One of my best resources is silent unity. I can't say enough about silent unity. Some of you here have worked in or may still be prayer associates in silent unity. And whenever I have a lesson to give, I don't know about you, but everybody gets nervous. So whenever I have a lesson to give, I'm really nervous. I'm thinking about what am I supposed to say? I go to my affirmation, "Lord, fill my mouth with worthwhile stuff and nudge me when I've said enough." I do that over and over again, over and over again. And then I pick up the phone and I call silent unity. And the voice on the other end of the phone is so soothing. At this time of the year, you may have to wait a while when you call silent unity, and they'll tell you in that recording that sometimes the call volume is really high because they stand in a lot of gaps. There are people who are calling 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for every kind of thing you cannot even imagine that's going on in their life. And there's somebody on the end of that phone who knows what to say, how to say it, and at the right time. And that happened to me day before yesterday. Day before yesterday, I called silent unity. My talk was all over the map. I got to keep it down to this time frame. I want to say what people really are here to learn, to listen to. And I've got all these ideas in my head. I want to feed you. I want you to drink out of this fire hose, which is typically my way. I give you about 10 different things in one talk. It could be 10 different talks, but I got to get it all out. So I call silent unity to kind of calm me down and remind me that it's not me, but the Spirit of God within me who does the work. And at the end of that conversation, that's exactly what she said. She gave me a scripture, Matthew 10:19. And I couldn't believe that I hadn't found this scripture for myself in this talk. But she was standing in the gap. And when you stand in the gap for somebody, the right words at the right time just come out, and you don't even know what you said. She said to me, Matthew 10:19 says, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking. She was standing in the gap. And you know what? She's still standing in the gap. And all those prayer associates at Silent Unity have my prayer request in a box, like our boxes, and they are standing in the gap for me. They are standing in the gap. Some 400,000 Americans who stood in the gap for our freedom are buried at Arlington Cemetery. And countless others, like my father, who's buried at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. My uncles, many of our family members are buried at cemeteries around the world, not just in our country. Some were buried in other parts of the world. The total number of Americans killed in all U.S. wars is estimated at 1.1 million people. Think about that for a second. 1.1 million have stood in the gap for us. In World War II alone, during the Normandy campaign, more than 29,000 Americans were killed. And I'm so blessed that my dad made it home, only to be killed in another war on the streets of Kansas City, Kansas. So if you are standing or have stood in the gap as a member of the armed forces, the Army, the Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Peace Corps, if you're a member of law enforcement or have been, emergency responders, please stand so that we can stand in the gap right now for you and give you our gratitude. Please stand. And for those who are not with us today, who are out protecting our freedom, we're standing in the gap. We're standing in the gap at home. Somebody may call you on the phone one day and tell you something that's going on in their life, and you may be just astounded. But the reason you're called is because you have the ability to stand in the gap. Sometimes you don't have to say a word, just listen. Sometimes it's just a matter of saying, I care about you. A smile, a thank you, a hug. I can't tell you the number of times my husband and I have been somewhere and they find out he's a veteran and say, thank you for serving. That means a lot. Thank you for serving. And for all of those here in this church who serve us every day, our staff, our minister team, our chaplains, our greeters, our ushers, all of you, thank you for serving. You may not have served in the armed forces or have been a first responder, but all of us stand in the gap for someone. And I guarantee you, right now, where you are, someone somewhere is standing in the gap for you. I've been standing in the gap for the McDowells ever since their daughter made her transition, because I've been there where others stood in the gap for me. We need people to stand in the gap. I've been standing in the gap for Eugene since Bambi made her transition. Standing in the gap. We don't all go through the same things at the same time, so that those of us who aren't going through something have the opportunity, the ability to stand in that gap. Even if we've never experienced it, as human beings, knowing someone else is going through something should give us the awareness to hold the high watch, to hold them in the light, to stand in the gap. Dr. Martin Luther King said, everyone can be great because anyone can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to be able to navigate English to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. All you need is a heart full of grace, a soul strengthened by love. That's what service is about. And so, whenever someone shares a concern with you, just think about that phrase, what Reverend Julian shared with us, I'm standing in the gap. Even if you don't know what to say, maybe there are no words, just know that you are standing in the gap for whatever it is they're needing. I'm reminded of a favorite quote by one of my all-time favorite people here at Unity Temple, for whom I get to stand in the gap because she made her transition 4 years ago, Lily Riley. She was here for many, many years. And at one of my talks, when I was very nervous about what to say, she says, give them my favorite scripture. From John 9:4, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, for night comes when no one can work. As we decorate the graves of those fallen soldiers, men and women who have protected our freedom, and our family members who have crossed over to the other side, let us remember that they worked the work of the God that sent them to do what they had to do while it was day. It is their night. It is our day. We are charged with standing in the gap. If not you, who? If not now, when? As we move into meditation, hold in mind those who are standing in the gap and have stood in the gap for you, and ask yourself, who am I standing in the gap for? Let's take that into meditation.